Hello class, my name is Chuck Gutenson and I'll be working with you this semester on the United's course in Church Renewal. This is a class that I'm very passionate and excited about, so I'm looking forward to studying with each of you this semester. I look forward to hearing what contributions you have to make to our discussions, as well to see what responses and critiques you offer for the books and things that we work through this semester. I'd like to begin with an overview of the course. First of all, let me say that there are different sections for this particular course. An online section that's purely online, and then a hybrid section which has both online component and an on-campus component. The on-campus component happens at the end of this month, at the end of September. What I'm going to do, however, is post a lecture each week, a YouTube lecture, just like what you're going to get from this one. And that will be a requirement for both the online and the hybrid courses. I won't really make much distinction because we're going to be dealing with content. In this initial section, or initial lecture, I will make some distinction between the hybrid and the online courses as far as they're different in the syllabus, which even again isn't a whole lot different. I will be more specific in expectations in a written note that goes along with the post of this lecture, both in the hybrid and in the online class. Make sure that you read through that in some detail, and if there's any fuzziness or any questions that I need to review for you when you've completed hearing this lecture and then reading through those notes, please let me know, because we want to get that taken care of here as early as we can. Now, let me begin with a review of the syllabus. I have it here on my computer, so I just want to walk through that with you quickly. Some of the things I'm not going to hit, you can read the titles of the books as easily as I can read them off to you, but what I would like to do is hit through the objectives, talk a little about schedule, and then address the different assignments that will be due for the semester. So, on page 2 of the syllabus, I note the specific objectives for the course. 1, to widen your understanding of the developments in global Christianity. So we're going to look at church across the world, not just in the United States. We want to identify factors that have contributed to the decline of the church in the West, particularly Protestantism in North America. Then we want to look at, third, factors that have contributed to the flourishing of the church in the global South. What factors are causing that to be an area of rapid growth? And of course, ultimately, we'll want to see if we can figure out how we might bring those, which is the fourth objective, to come to grips with specific proposals for church renewal today, keeping in mind both the obstacles that we've identified in part 2 and the opportunities that we see for flourishing in other cultures. And then finally, to develop a theological vision for church renewal and church growth. Moving on down then to teaching strategies, as I indicated, I will each week, probably on Monday, post a lecture like this one. It will run probably 15 to 35 minutes or so, depending on the content for the day. That will be posted in the discussion center. It should be just a YouTube link that you'll either cut and paste or just click, depending on how I'm able to get that set up. In addition to that, I will be posting discussion questions that same day or the day after. I may post a lecture one day, let you watch that, and then the discussion questions will deal both with things that I addressed in the lecture, as well as excuse me, as well as things that come up in the reading that I may not have mentioned specifically in the lecture. And again, both the hybrid and the purely online classes will use this video or YouTube lecture format as well. This first week, we're dealing with the book Hijacked. The second week, we'll finish that up and move into the book on postmodernism, and then finish that up in the third week. You'll notice that the gathering week is on the week of September 24th. It's the 25th through the 28th. I have the readings laid out on the syllabus for each of the weeks. I'm not going to read through all of them. I just wanted to list the first couple to get us started. And then let me skip down to the assignments, or methods used for evaluation. And basically there will be 3 of those, 3 different means to use to determine a grade for this particular course. First, since these are online courses, then your participation in online discussion is a central component. So about 25% of the grade will relate to classroom participation. Now, for those of you in the hybrid class, that will be a sum of both our interaction on campus in the last week of September and your work here in the online portion. For those students in the purely online class, then of course our interaction will be 100% in the discussion center in the Moodle classroom. I look for those in the online class, pure online class, to make about 3 substantive interactions per week. Those interactions can come in form of an answer to one of the questions that I post. What I will probably do each week is list 4 to 10 study questions for that particular week. 3 or 4 of them I will put in bold, and the bold questions are the ones that I want us to bring back to the discussion center to discuss amongst us. So your substantive engagement is 150 words or more. It would be in response to one of those questions, or it can be response to one of your classmates' responses to one of those questions. So it doesn't have to be every one of you answering every single question on your own. It can build on each other's responses and still count as a substantive response. I'd like you to encourage each other, so a quick "that was really thoughtful" or "that was really helpful," or "can you tell me a little bit more about what you meant in your second paragraph?" Anything like that is good and is helpful for our conversation. That won't count as substantive engagement, but it does create the sort of learning environment that we would want to have, and so I encourage you to do that. For those of you in the hybrid class, as I said, it'll be a combination of your participation in the week that we're together as well as online. So I look for a couple, 1 to 2 substantive engagements per week from you folks, 2 to 3 for the folks who are in the purely online class. Alright, so class participation will be 25% of the grade. You will do critical reviews of 3 of the books that we read this semester. Okay, so of the 6 books that we read, I'll let you select them. It would be a critical review of 2 to 4 pages on that particular book. Actually, if you get all the way to 4, that's probably a little long, but I give you up to 4 pages, double spaced, assuming that you'd like to use that much space. You don't have to. Excuse me. So 3 of the 6 books at your selection can be books that you do critical reviews on. I would like those in by the end of the week after we finish reading that particular book. So we finish Hijacked in week 2. If you decide to do a critical review of it, I would need it by the end of week 3. As we get to the end of the semester, of course, I won't have that sort of freedom. If you want to do a review on the very last book we read, then I'll need you to turn that in the end of the very last week. And that together counts as 35% of your grade. For those of you in the hybrid course, I will make some notes about an option that you may choose instead of these critical reviews. So I'll again write that up for a post in the discussion center. And then finally, each of you will select a final topic for the course. That will count. It says in the syllabus here 50%, but that should be 40%, 25% for class participation, 35% for the 3 critical reviews, and then 40% for the final paper to add up to 100%. That final paper is on a topic that you and I agree to individually, having to do with some aspect of church renewal. You might decide to do it on evangelism. You may decide to do it on church planting. You might want to do an overview of successful methods that are being used in the Global South. You may want to focus on a couple of the critiques of the church in North America. So anything that you want to try, just as long as you and I discuss it and get that worked out, I'm pretty flexible on what those topics can be. 10 to 12 pages, and that will be due at the very last day of class, the end of the last week of the semester. Okay, I believe that takes care of the assignments, the initial schedule, and then the methodology that we'll use for the course as a whole. So with that, excuse me, I'll consider that the review of the syllabus complete, and now I want to move into the things I want to talk about in this particular week. First thing I want each of you to do in the discussion center is to do a personal introduction. Tell us a little about yourself. You can tell us your age if you want to. You can tell us your hobbies, or tell us where you are in your course of study, what your long-term ministry plans are, any of those sorts of things that just help us get to know you a little bit better. I'll do that as well, so you'll know a little bit more about me, and then I'll look to see what each of you have to say about, by way of personal introduction. With that then, I would like to get into the content that I want to lay out for the first week. This will be the lecture on the material for the first week, and as I said, I'll be posting some discussion questions to guide the reading and the discussing of these elements as well. First of all, I suppose you could say that it's cliche to say that the church in the West is in decline. if you take a look at the studies that Pew has done over time, there is a significant decline in the number of people who self-identify as Christians. And of course, if you looked at changes in behavior, it's even more significant than that. In 1948, there was a study done, and the question that was asked was, how many people self-identified as Christians? And in the United States, the answer was about 91%. So just a little over 9 of every 10 Americans considered themselves to be Christian. In 2009, the last one of these studies that I'm aware of, the same question was asked, how many people self-identify as Christian, or do you self-identify as Christian? And the percentage of people that answered that with yes, we self-identify as Christian was 78%. Now from 91 to 78 over the course of 60 years, maybe that doesn't sound too bad. I think it's terribly bad actually. It's about a 20% decline over the course of that period. And actually, if you go look at that chart over the extended period of time, starting in 48 to 2009, you find that the vast majority of those changes occur from the middle 60s on, to say the last, and while this is a 60-year period, 48 to 09, 61, it's really more like 40 years of that the vast majority of this decline has occurred. They separate between Catholics and Protestants, so you can get an idea of how that's changing. As it turns out, if you look at the Catholic people, the folks who identify as Catholics, self-identify, it starts at 22% or roughly, and it ends at about 22%. So they've managed to remain relatively flat during this period. It has gone up and then back down. You know, you can make of that what you want to. But at the beginning of the period and at the end of the period, Catholics were at about 22%. So if you take that, subtract the Catholics out, then you can see that the vast majority of the decline has occurred within Protestantism. And if you subtract out that 22% in 48 and subtract it out in 09, instead of 91 to 78, you get 69 to 56, which of course has a percentage. I mean, still 13 points, but it's a bigger percentage of the total. So the bulk of the decline that's occurred in America, North America, with regard to self-identification as Christian, has largely been within the realms of Protestantism. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. I suspect one of those is a rise of what might be called, well, it's generally called the New Atheism. Some people even think of it as evangelistic atheism. It's actually not just simply the denial of the existence of God, but it's the active engagement of the culture to try to persuade other people to agree in denying the existence of God as well. A number of books have been written, and if you visit some of the websites where religion is discussed, but not purely religious sites, just places where Christians and non-Christians show up, you can often see some pretty rancorous commentary going on between the two. The atheists are much more vocal about their denial of God's existence, and not just that, but openly critical of those of us who do have faith, those of us who do believe in God. So I think part of the decline, it's, whether it's the cause, an outcome, I don't know, but it's certainly a correlation that as we've seen this decline in the number of people who self-identify as Christian grow, the degree to which those who are atheists has not just grown, but it's become more belligerent, more open, more evangelistic, again, for lack of a better word, in the way that they've articulated their lack of faith. I think, however, for our purposes, when we're thinking about church renewal, probably the place where we need to look is in the mirror. We need to look at the things that are going on in the church that has caused the culture to turn away. I know it's always very easy for us as Christians to look at those who are outside the church, criticizing the church and say, well, they just don't get it, or of course they're going to be critical of the church. We're telling them that they're not engaging in moral behavior. We're trying to give them examples of what moral behavior should be. Of course they don't like us. That's an easy thing to do, but as I hope you can see from the rest of what I have to say, it's not just too easy, it's too simplistic, and probably isn't really the major problem going on. There are two books that I would encourage you to take a look at that aren't on the reading assignment, but if you want to dig more into the problem of the decline of the church in North America, you should read Unchristian. Dave Kinnaman, who's now the head of the Barna Group, and Gabe Lyon, that did this study together. And then the next one, called Next Christian. These two books, particularly Unchristian, looks at critiques that the culture has to level against the church. And what's interesting is that Kinnaman isn't just asking people who are outside the church to criticize the church. He's going to people who have been in the church but have left for some reason. Why is it that you've left? Why is it that you're no longer active in the church? And why is it that you seem to be moving away from the Christian faith? There are 6 major things that come up in the course of that book. I sort of call them the big 6, and I think they're the ones that we as Christians have to look at. Before I get to that, though, let me just point out that this whole notion of trying to look at ourselves and being self-critical first is a very biblical notion. Do you know where the first demon exorcism occurs in the book of Luke? It's actually in the synagogue. Now, you stop and think about that for a minute. Of all the places that Luke could have recounted, I mean, he has all this material that he's picking and choosing from in order to put together his gospel, his account to Theophilus of what he's learned about the life of Jesus. And the first demon exorcism that he tells us about is one that's occurred in the synagogue. Now, as I recall, N.T. Wright makes a rather important set of points around that, because what Luke, and of course in his view, in Luke's view, what Jesus is trying to say to the church of the day, to the synagogue, is quit looking at the culture around you and blaming them for your problems. It's time to look inside. Where the demons are right in the middle of the holy place. And so if that's corrupted, what sort of message can we be presenting to the world at large? So on these, the big 6, as I said, my first exposure to this book came when Shane Claiborne, I used to work at Sojourners, and we put on a thing we called a Justice Revival in Dallas. Now, the Justice Revivals were an attempt to unite a call to personal faith in Jesus with a call to be concerned about social justice as well. I don't know if you know this or not. Some of you who I've seen your name show up on the list here, and we studied together in evangelism about a year ago. We talked about the fact that the altar call, as we know it in Protestant churches today, actually had its beginning in the work of Finney. And he used them when people would come forward. He was trying to sign up people to participate in the abolitionist movement, the movement against slavery. And so the altar calls were a way to get them to come forward and to sign up as participants in the abolitionist movement. And so the idea that personal evangelism is all, personal conversion is all that evangelism is about, really misses the point, because what God's calling us to is a different way of living, a different way of being in the world. It isn't just, get your ticket stamped for hell avoidance or as a ticket into heaven, but rather it's the beginning of the transformation of the world. I love the way Wesley puts together justifying grace, sanctifying grace, and eschatological grace. In the course on UM Theology, we talk about this in a lot more detail, but justification, the conversion point to Wesley, is just the doorway to salvation. It's the moving from being lost to being saved. And then sanctification is actually living in the house, to stick with the metaphor. It's the process of our being converted, our practices, our behaviors, everything being converted until we live the life that pleases God. And then that sanctification rolls on into eschatological grace, or into the point where this mortal takes on immortality. Wesley's was a very much a realized eschatology. That final transformation begins with the work that we do in the world today. I used to say in a presentation that I would do on social justice that being concerned about issues of justice, care for the poor, care for the marginalized, and so on, all those things that Jesus mentions in the second half of Matthew, the pericope of the Great Judgment in Matthew 25, those things aren't something that we add on to being a Christian. They are how being a Christian gets worked out in our day-to-day lives. So Shane Claiborne was at this Justice Revival that we had. It was in Rich Nathan's church over near Columbus. There was a vineyard church. And Shane began his sermon by saying that we Christians have a PR problem. And what he was talking about were 3 findings from this book Unchristian by Kinnaman and Lyon. First of all, he said, when asked to identify some term with the term Christian, what were the terms that first came to mind? And the three that came to mind first were hypocritical, judgmental, and anti-gay or anti-homosexual. Let me go ahead and round out the whole six for you, and then I want to talk about them a little bit. So, hypocritical, judgmental, anti-gay, too political, conversionist, and too sheltered. So let me say a little bit about each one of those, because I do believe that they're all things that we're going to have to deal with as we talk about renewing the church. Hypocritical. People look at us in the church, and for the most part they can't tell that there's any difference between us and the culture at large. So when it comes time to get up on Sunday morning, ask yourself, if your perception was that there's no difference, no value added, if you will, to going to church, would you get up and go to church? I recall visiting a number of churches when I was traveling a good deal on the weekends, and it was far too often that I would find myself partway through the service just wondering to myself, if I weren't already a Christian, would I have gotten up to come for this? And this whole notion of us being hypocritical, us not living out the life that Jesus calls us to, is one that's huge. Perhaps another way to talk about this is to say that if you went out and did a survey, you went out on the street and anybody who would stop and answer a question, you ask them just one question. Let's say you ask them this question. Name the three greatest people to have ever lived. Three greatest people who've ever lived in all of history of humanity. Here's what I think you'll find. On some ridiculously high percentage of cases, probably not 100%, but way up there, Jesus would be listed as one of the three. And in many cases, he would be listed as the most significant person who's ever lived. That image of Christ is not just prevalent, but it's a positive image. When Christians get criticized for being hypocritical, what they generally mean is you guys preach one thing, that is, you preach living like Jesus, and you actually live a different way. We can't reconcile those differences. So what you have, we have a Lord, a Savior, a founder, if you will, for the church, who has really good brand recognition and a really positive brand image. All right? He's recognized by a large percentage of the people, and it's a positive image overwhelmingly. Now imagine that you had time for a second question. Ask them what they would say about the church, or how, or what, just some positive or negative reaction, and what you would get is an overwhelmingly negative reaction. We have high brand recognition, that is, people know what a church is, but we have poor brand image. The church is generally the subject of criticism, and this whole issue of being hypocritical, not living up to the things that we say we stand for, is a central issue. Second, the one about judgmentalism. Why is that exactly? Why do we feel the need to start off our conversation with people that we think are sinners by being condemning, being judgmental? And yet that is exactly what seems to have happened. Now, I'll be the first to admit that the culture at large that we live in today is a judgmental, critical, condemning sort of culture. I've sometimes used the phrase the Don Rickleization of culture, because the sort of humor that Don Rickles engaged in for the most part was to make fun of people. Funny was to laugh at someone for something stupid or judged to be stupid that they did. So it was a judgmental, it was a critical attitude. If you look at our two political parties, since we're reading Hijack, look at our two political parties. They overwhelmingly engage in criticism of the other side. They're stupid because, or I can't believe people believe that because, so it's always this critical attitude. Well, we in the church are viewed that way by people outside. It seems to them that the first thing we're about is telling them how bad they are. Let me tell you a story about some of you who've been in my class before may have heard this one, but I'm working on a book called Church Worth Getting Up For. I'm about a third to halfway done with it at the moment. And what I did was interview a number of church leaders from across the country. One of those was Chris Say, who's head of Ecclesia Church in Houston. He was telling me a story about they're moving into a new building, and this building that they were moving into is both the place where Chris and his family lives and where they worship. And so he went out one after our evening, I guess it was, onto the back area behind the house there, behind this building. And he said, the first thing that he noticed was a group of women who looked to him to be the tallest group of women he'd seen gathered together in a long time. But as he got closer, he said he discovered that these weren't women at all. They were transvestite prostitutes. And it turns out this place where their church was, or was going to be, was a place where transvestite prostitutes hung out. And so I had started to ask him. I was trying to think to myself, what do I ask next? And what did you do? Did you call the police? And before I could say anything, he said something like this: well, what could I do but invite them in for coffee? Now, he didn't feel like the first thing he had to do was tell them that what they were doing was wrong, though I'm sure that he agrees that what they're doing is wrong. Somehow, we feel an obligation to just be overly critical of the culture around us. And people pick up on that, and they don't feel welcome, they don't feel treated with hospitality, and they don't come back. And sometimes when they've been with us, they decide to leave, as I was mentioning. So, hypocritical, judgmental, anti-homosexual. I don't want to get into a debate about, I'm sure probably in a class this size we have people on both sides of this issue. I don't want to get into a debate about that, but let me ask this question. Could we agree that wherever you come down on the question of whether homosexuality is sin or not, could we agree that one of the top 3 things that people say when they identify church people, Christians, shouldn't be that we hate homosexuals? Can I leave it at that? And it's really a sort of a subset of this judgmental nature that people experience from the church. The next one then is too political. That's why I'm having you read the book Hijacked, is it gives you a chance to look at it, the analysis that Mike Slaughter and I did on talking about how the partisanship in our culture has made its way increasingly into the church. I hear this all the time from folks about how once we get into the electoral season, there's just this rancor that sort of rises up in the church between those on the right and those on the left, politically that is, and sometimes it ends up with people leaving, hurt and angry. I want to say for the record that neither Democrats nor Republicans are God's party, and we need to quit acting like they are. What the culture often sees is when Christians come out of the woodwork is around the political season. That's when political or religious leaders are on TV and they're being quizzed as if they're political leaders, or asking them to make judgments about different candidates. And it looks to the culture like a lot of what's going on in the church is being driven by a political agenda rather than a gospel agenda. So I want to discuss that whole issue some more as we dig more into the book, and I'll post some questions about it. But too political is the 4th of these 6 criticisms that the culture offers of the church. 5th is, is conversionist. By that they mean we're all about trying to convert them. We're not so much into loving them. I was in a discussion with a friend of mine about this not too long ago, and what we were trying to get at was how it is we demonstrate to people our love for them quite apart from whether they're ever going to respond to the gospel or not. Of course we want them to, but here's the way we finally put the question. If a new person comes to your church, and if you knew in advance they would never respond to the gospel, would you still treat them with the same love and respect as if you thought they would respond to the gospel? And it seems to me if the answer to that question is no, if somehow our goal of converting them has become elevated higher than our goal of loving them, that somehow we're missing the boat. The folks who come in to visit the church, who have been in the church, they very easily sense how much we see them as the opportunity to earn spiritual, or the spiritual notches on our belt, or notches on our spiritual belt, however you want to say that, and it turns them off. And somehow we need to think about how it is we love people and trust God's Holy Spirit to work in their lives and to call them to Himself without us feeling like we have to be so obviously conversionist, if you will. And if you read the book on Christian that I'm mentioning, Kinnaman gives some examples from dialogues that he's had with people of the kinds of interactions that create this feeling. And then finally, the 6th one is the perception that we're too sheltered. The idea that we are anti-scientific, that we're anti-factual, we're anti-intellectual, that we sort of have started our own schools so that we can get out of the culture. It's this whole view that we're too sectarian and inadequately aware of what's going on in the world around us. Again, we can agree or disagree, I suppose, with each one of these criticisms, but the real goal for us to think about here in this class on church renewal is what are the truths that underlie these different criticisms, and how do we, as part of our church renewal efforts, begin to undermine and change those things. And let me tell you this, it's not going to come by us having better arguments for why they're wrong about these criticisms. It's only going to come when we show them that they're wrong by us actually being a different kind of people than their perceptions. Now, the biggest group that had when you looked at the different age groups and this particular set of criticisms, the group for whom this set of criticisms was highest, that is, the highest percentage of people had one or more of these criticisms, was the demographic 35 or so and below. And that's a big deal. Overwhelmingly, these were the kind of negative criticisms, again, from people outside the church and who had been in the church but left. These are the kind of criticisms that they have of us, and this is a big deal long term. I mean, if we can't change our perception, and not just change the perception, but change the reality behind the perception for that particular demographic, it does not bode well for the church in the future. We could very well be looking at a situation where we're like Europe, where instead of a significant portion of the population self-identifying as Christian, it could be a significant minority of people in the foreseeable future. It's interesting that in a Newsweek article, Stan Hauerwas, I think it's been within the last 4 or 5 years, was quoted as saying that God is killing the church in America and we, expletive deleted, well deserve it. His point was that we had gotten so far off track, and these are the kind of criticisms I suspect that were in the back of his mind as he made that comment, but that we had gotten so far off track that maybe God was ready to give up on us. Or maybe God was actively trying to redo things in a way that just lets the church fall off to the side. Now, that's probably too strong a way to put it, but I often use that quote from Hauerwas to make the point that it is possible for the church to become so corrupted that turning away from it is actually a sign of spiritual sensitivity. We in the church need to be aware of that and make sure that that doesn't happen. Søren Kierkegaard said it like this. I have 2 or 3 quotes from him that I really like. This one, he said, this is Gutenson paraphrase, but it goes something like, "Those who do not practice Christianity as it is practiced in my country today have one sin the less, and it's not an insignificant one, in that they don't consider God to be a fool." What he was saying is that Christianity in his country, as it was being practiced in his days, would have been the early 1800s in Denmark, had become so corrupted that it was actually a sign of spiritual sensitivity to turn away from it. May God deliver us from letting that become the case here in the U.S. I believe, however, that we're gathered together because we believe that there is a possibility for the church to be renewed. For me, giving up on the church is not an option. I believe that Jesus established a church as the avenue through which he would mediate his grace to the world. The hope of the world is Jesus, and the church is his selected tool for getting the good news out. And so just giving up on the church isn't an option for me, and I hope it isn't for you either. I hope what we're going to do together is take a hard look at the criticisms that we hear, of the shortcomings that we have in the church, and we begin to ask ourselves, how can we become the kind of church that draws people to us? Not because we've engaged in clever marketing schemes, but because we're sharing the good news. And you know what the good news is? The good news is, to put it in Wesleyan terms, is that God will do anything short of violating the free will of his creatures to draw them into relationship with himself. We have lost that sense of being able to articulate the good news in a way that it sounds like good news to those who hear us. And I want to explore that a little bit more as we go along throughout the semester. Finally, I just wanted to make one last note. Do you know what was really, to me, most disappointing about this set of critiques or set of responses that Kinnaman got when he asked people to name the 1 or 2 words that came to mind when they thought of the term Christian? What was disappointing is that grace, grace-filled, love, nothing like that showed up on the list in any significant measure. And that's what should be at the top. When we are being the kind of people that we should be, then I think that what we're going to see is people identifying the church as a place of love and protection and safety and so on. Not that we're condoning sin, but that we're recognizing sin in our own lives and seeking the Spirit's power to overcome our own sin as we call others to come alongside of us and invoke the Spirit in their own lives in the same way. I look forward to engaging with you in the discussion center. That's pretty much all I have to cover for today. I will post this probably on Labor Day. I'm taping it late on Sunday afternoon, and we'll have it up sometime tomorrow, and then on Tuesday or Wednesday morning I will post a set of discussion questions. The first thing though, remember, give us something about yourself, a brief post of self-identification and introducing yourself to the class. Look forward to our studies this semester. Have a good day.